"You're not going to live with us anymore, you're a burden," the son said as he dropped his elderly father's suitcase on the cold sidewalk in front of the cheap nursing home, turning his back without looking at him, as if getting rid of an inconvenient piece of trash. He tried to reach the door still slightly open, but the older son pushed it shut with force, as someone who closes a problem. The pickup truck sped off so quickly that gravel flew against the father's fragile legs, making him stumble as he held onto his torn suitcase as if it were all that remained of his dignity. The icy Ohio wind cut across his wrinkled face, and no one there cared that a man nearly 80 was being left alone on the sidewalk of a rundown nursing home, where the smell of mold and despair seeped through cracked windows. He didn't ask for anything, didn't beg. He just stood there, his breath short, feeling the injustice burn in his chest as he watched his two sons drive away without looking back, laughing to themselves, pleased to finally get rid of a problem. If this scene made you outraged, subscribe now. Here, every story reveals painful truths many prefer to hide, and you won't want to miss the next twists exposing who truly deserves to pay for what they've done. A nursing home worker opened the door and simply pointed inside impatiently, as if receiving a late package. The father, taking slow steps, entered carrying the heavy suitcase, each movement exposing the recent abandonment. Inside, the narrow hallway was filled with damp shadows, flickering lights, and patients murmuring things that mixed pain with exhaustion. He felt a sharp twinge in his back but kept going, trying to stand tall because he wouldn't give his sons the satisfaction of seeing him broken. The only thing echoing in his mind were the cold words the youngest repeated in the car. "It doesn't make sense to spend our money on someone who can't contribute anything." The phrase was so cruel it sounded rehearsed. Meanwhile, the sons, elsewhere in the city, were discussing renovations in their new house, about how they would finally have space to live in peace. They didn't mention their father even once. To them, that decision was purely pragmatic. It was expensive to take care of an elderly man, and his health insurance didn't cover anything that actually mattered. The older son opened a beer, leaned back on the sofa, and commented that their father probably wouldn't last long in that place. The younger laughed, saying that would actually be convenient. The audience would feel their blood boil at how naturally they spoke about their own father's life as if he were disposable. Back at the nursing home, the man was taken to a tiny room where the bed creaked at the slightest touch, and the tattered curtain let a cold wind in. The worker tossed a crumpled form on the table and left without even saying goodnight. The father took a deep breath, trying to push away the tightness in his throat. He sat down, feeling the weight of abandonment fall onto his shoulders like a silent avalanche. It wasn't just loneliness, it was betrayal, the complete destruction of something he had believed his whole life. That family meant mutual care. A nurse rushed in, asking him to sign a few documents, and he noticed his name had been registered as a temporary case with no guarantees. At that moment, anger began to bubble inside him. Not explosive anger, but the kind that sleeps deeply and wakes slowly, ready to grow over time. He felt a sharp pain in his chest. But it wasn't just physical. It was the weight of injustice. He knew his sons didn't see him as a person but as dead weight, and that truth hurt more than anything. Still, when he was alone again, something inside him didn't break. Something hardened. He looked at the suitcase, opened the zipper, and touched an old envelope tucked inside. His eyes filled with tears, but not from pain, from certainty. His sons had no idea what they were throwing away, and he wouldn't reveal anything yet. Not at that moment. The abandonment had just happened. The wound was still open, bleeding. But it was in that hot blood that a silent promise was born, that this humiliation would not go unpunished. The hallway creaked with heavy footsteps and long moans coming from other rooms. The father closed the envelope, put it back, and lay down, facing the damp wall. The abandonment hadn't just been a cruel decision. It had been the spark. Something was about to begin, and he knew the world doesn't let such great injustices go unanswered, especially when a hidden truth is ready to turn everything upside down. He woke up before dawn, not because he was rested, but because the metallic noise of the cleaning cart hitting the hallway walls tore him from his restless sleep. The room smelled of stale dampness, and the rough sheet clung to his skin as if trying to remind him that this was no home. It was a warehouse of forgotten people. He sat up slowly, feeling his body protest, and took a few seconds to understand where he was. The memory of the previous night's abandonment returned violently, like a punch to the stomach, and for a moment he had to breathe deeply so the anguish wouldn't swallow everything. When he opened the door, he found a tray on the floor with weak coffee and a piece of hard bread. No good morning, no name called. Only the automatic routine of a place that treated the elderly as tasks to be completed. He picked up the tray carefully, trying to keep his dignity even in the face of that, and carried it inside, placing it on the crooked table. When he touched the bread, the sour smell made him pull his hand back. Was this what his sons thought he deserved? Was this the life they believed was enough for a father who had worked 40 years in a factory in Cleveland, who gave education, food, and a roof to the same sons who now discarded him? As he tried to swallow the lukewarm coffee, he heard a deep cough in the room next door, followed by muffled cries from someone asking for help. No one came. The indignation began to boil again, stronger, heavier. He stood up with effort and walked into the hallway, where he saw a woman fallen on the floor holding her hip, her eyes wide with pain. The worker who was supposed to be on duty was leaning against the wall on the other side, scrolling on his phone, indifferent to the scene. The father knelt beside her, gently touching her shoulder, trying to comfort her until someone finally decided to act. The scene was so cruel, so absurd, that he felt his heart race, not from fear, but from fury. When the worker realized there were too many witnesses to keep ignoring the situation, he finally approached, huffing with irritation, as if it were an inconvenience to do his own job. He lifted the woman without care, making her moan, and dragged her into the room. The father stayed there staring at the empty hallway, feeling the humiliation of the place seep into his bones. It was at that exact moment he realized his sons had not only abandoned him, they had put him in an environment where no one cared if he lived or died. Back in the room, he opened his suitcase again and found a different, smaller envelope containing some medical documents. As he read the notes, he discovered that his sons had left unpaid health insurance bills and had even forged a signature to transfer responsibility to the nursing home and avoid any charges. The discovery hit like a knife. They hadn't just discarded him. They had planned everything so they would never again have to deal with any cost or obligation. And now, if something happened to him in there, everything would conveniently be far from their hands. He felt a knot form in his throat, but instead of crying, he clenched his fists. The abandonment had been cruel, yes, but the calculated coldness of the documents revealed a level of inhumanity that made him tremble with indignation. He stood up with difficulty and decided to walk toward the courtyard, where the weak morning sun was beginning to touch the cracked ground. On the way, he passed people who looked like ghosts, forgotten men and women, each with a lost gaze that told stories of silent abandonment. He felt a sting in his conscience. It wasn't just him. It was an entire system that accepted children throwing away their parents like old objects. When he reached the courtyard, he sat on a broken bench and watched a young nurse hurrying by, not even noticing him. Then a figure stopped beside him, a middle-aged man, wearing a worn coat and with an attentive look. He introduced himself as Michael, saying he visited his mother there and had seen when the sons dropped off the father the night before. Michael commented with a tone of mixed disgust and disbelief that he had never seen anyone leave their own father that way. The sentence hit hard but also brought a spark of something new. Not help, not yet. A witness. Someone had seen. Someone knew. The father remained silent, only nodding. Michael kept talking, telling stories about the place, about abuses that happened in secret, about the corrupt administration that profited off abandoned elderly people. Each word increased the pressure in the father's chest. He felt his throat dry up. The humiliation was too big to carry alone. When Michael said goodbye, promising to return later to see his mother, the father remained alone in the courtyard, watching the dry tree branches sway in the wind. The pain was still great, but something had changed that morning. A realization slowly formed in his mind. Not about revenge, but about consequences. Because the son's abandonment had more layers than they imagined. And because there were things hidden in the bottom of that suitcase that could turn everyone's fate upside down, in a way they would never see coming. The wind blew stronger, lifting dust, and he closed his eyes, feeling the cold touch his face. The pain was there, alive and throbbing. But along with it, the first sign was being born that this story was far from over. And the sons, so confident that they had gotten rid of a problem, were about to discover that they had planted something far heavier than they ever imagined. When he returned from the courtyard, he found the door to his own room open, and a staff member rummaging through his suitcase as if he were sifting through trash. The man was digging through everything without any shame, pushing clothes to the floor, opening envelopes, examining papers as if he had the right to do so. The father stopped at the doorway, feeling something snap inside. Not fear, but raw indignation. He asked, with a firm voice despite the exhaustion, what was going on. The staff member didn't even turn around. He only replied with disdain that he needed to check if the father had dangerous objects or improper valuables. Words that, in that context, meant one thing: institutionalized theft. He walked into the room with slow, controlled steps, trying to keep his blood from boiling over. The staff member finally turned when he found the thickest envelope, the one the father kept hidden. Before he could open it, the father lunged forward and snatched the paper from his hands with more strength than he thought he had. The staff member looked surprised, even offended, but stepped back when he saw the hardened expression on the face of the man who, just hours earlier, had seemed so broken. "If you touch my things again, I'll call the police," the father said. And although his voice was low, it carried a weight the other man understood immediately. The staff member let out an irritated sigh and left, muttering veiled threats about how nothing there worked if a resident decided to cause trouble. Once he was alone, the father sat on the edge of the bed, breathing deeply, trying to control the tremor in his hands. He opened the envelope to confirm that nothing had been touched. Inside was the document he had kept for decades, the deed to a property in rural Pennsylvania, a valuable piece of land he had never mentioned to his sons because he believed he would divide everything with them when the right time came. But now, after the cruel and calculated abandonment, that deed was no longer just an asset. It had become a silent weapon. Still, he closed the envelope and stored it away again, like someone protecting a secret not yet ready to be revealed. In the hallway, he heard a heated argument. Two nurses were discussing budget cuts, complaining about management pressuring them to take in more discarded residents to offset recent fines for mistreatment. The word fine sparked a flicker of curiosity. They spoke quickly, nervously, mentioning that a state inspection was approaching. That was why they were rummaging through belongings, why they treated everyone with such disregard. They were desperate, trying to hide the chaos inside. The information hit the father's mind like a brick. It wasn't just family abandonment. The entire system was rotten, and now he was trapped inside it. As he walked down the hallway to clear his head, he found Michael again. The man was sitting on the reception bench with a frustrated expression, talking on the phone to someone about his mother. Apparently, they had lost her medical file, delaying her treatment. When he hung up, Michael let out a long sigh, looked at the father and said, "They don't take care of anyone here. It's just money in and out. The rest can rot." The father nodded, and for the first time since he'd been abandoned, he let slip a few details about what had happened the night before. Not everything, just enough for Michael to grasp the magnitude of the cruelty. Michael listened incredulous and then said something that shifted the air between them. "Your sons are going to pay dearly for this. The world doesn't let this kind of thing go unpunished." The father, silent, fixed his gaze on the floor. He didn't answer, but those words echoed deeply. He didn't want blind revenge, but he wanted justice. And now there were witnesses, documents, flaws in the system that could be exposed. None of this had been planned, but everything seemed to be aligning like pieces that had waited years to find their place. While they talked, an announcement echoed through the nursing home speakers, a warning for residents' relatives to seek the administration due to contractual changes. Michael stood up immediately, irritated, saying it smelled like a scam. The father watched the growing commotion in the lobby, relatives arguing, nervous staff, papers being rushed into a locked room. The atmosphere in that place was shifting, and for the first time since the abandonment, he felt that something external, something bigger, was about to erupt. But the biggest turning point of that day came when one of the nurses, rushing by, dropped a folder on the floor, papers scattered, and the father instinctively bent down to help. Among the documents, he saw a list of names, including his own, marked as resident with no financial responsible party. His name had been placed in the most neglected category, where no one took responsibility for anything. Not health, not well-being, not safety. That meant that if he died there, no one would even be notified immediately. Indignation swelled so powerfully that the air seemed heavier. He stored that information inside himself with the same intensity with which he guarded the deed in the envelope. He didn't know exactly how, but he began to realize that all of this, the abandonment, the decaying nursing home, the internal corruption, the greed of his sons, was aligning into something much greater. The afternoon faded, casting an orange glow through the dirty windows, and the father walked back to the courtyard. He sat and watched the last shards of daylight disappear. He felt a deep exhaustion, but also something new, a tension that didn't come from pain, but from anticipation, as if he were standing atop a hill, about to witness an avalanche descending toward the ones who truly deserved to be hit. Because in the silence of that late afternoon, a certainty took shape. His sons believed they had won, but with each passing minute, the moment approached when life would show them that no one abandons an innocent father without paying the appropriate price. At the same moment, the father watched the sunset through the stained glass of the nursing home's courtyard. On the other side of the city, his sons were drowning in a chaos they had not foreseen, chaos already beginning to swallow the comfort they had earned at the cost of abandoning him. The older son, Mark, received an urgent call from the bank, something about a pending issue in the paperwork for the new house. He answered irritably, assuming it was just another bureaucratic delay. But the seriousness in the attendant's voice made him freeze. There was suspicion of fraud in one of the signatures submitted, and the financing process had been temporarily blocked. He tried to argue that it was impossible, that everything had been handled by a trusted office, but the response was direct and cold. "We need the legal responsible party to come in personally for clarification." The legal responsible party. The father. Mark hung up so abruptly he nearly dropped the phone. He glanced at his brother Ryan, who was on the couch playing video games as if life were perfect. "We have to talk to him," Mark said in a tense tone he rarely used. Ryan paused the game slowly with the look of someone calculating how much work he would now need to do to fix a problem he himself had created. "Talk to him, why? He's fine there. We already fixed our problem." Mark repeated the bank's information, and for the first time since the abandonment, real worry appeared on Ryan's face. Meanwhile, at the nursing home, the father was having dinner alone when the director walked into the cafeteria with sharp, hurried steps. The staff straightened up, trying to look busy. She seemed tense, something that drew his attention immediately. She announced that state inspectors would be visiting in 3 days and that everyone must cooperate to make the environment appear well managed. The words were pretty, but the subtext was rotten. They would hide everything, absolutely everything, even the dust under the beds. The director cast a look at the father as if seeing him as a risk. A man far too lucid, far too observant. Someone who could easily notice what shouldn't be seen and speak what shouldn't be spoken. He felt the weight of that look, a silent warning to stay quiet. But what she didn't know was that he no longer had anything to lose. And when someone has nothing to lose, everything changes. After dinner, Michael showed up again, even angrier this time. He had discovered that his mother had been receiving the wrong medication for weeks. He spoke loudly, outraged, and the director tried to calm him with robotic, empty responses. When she walked away, Michael sat beside the father and whispered, filled with fury, that he was thinking of reporting everything before the inspection. The father listened carefully. That could be the first domino tile to fall. And then, as if fate were slowly tightening an invisible vice, the first strong micro-turn happened. Mark and Ryan decided to go to the nursing home that very night. They arrived hours later, full of rehearsed strategy, pretending concern so they could convince the father to sign a few quick paperwork documents. But the atmosphere wasn't what they expected. The receptionist, exhausted, received them coldly and said they would have to wait. They complained, as they always did, as if the world revolved around them. The father, hearing the noise at the reception desk, slowly came out of his room, steadying himself against the wall. When he saw the two of them, his face showed no surprise, only an ancient, deep weariness that mixed hurt with something his sons had never seen in him: distrust. Mark opened the fake smile he always used when he wanted something. Ryan approached with his usual overly relaxed posture. The father observed them with a calmness that did not match the recent abandonment. They spoke quickly, trying to control the situation, explaining that they just needed a signature to solve important things. The father didn't say no. He didn't say yes. He simply stared at them, and his silence was the first real victory since the previous day. Neither son could withstand that gaze for long. They felt small, exposed, like children caught doing something wrong. Because they were. Suddenly a scream echoed from the end of the hallway. A fragile resident had fallen out of bed and no one showed up to help. The father and Michael were the first to run, while Mark and Ryan stayed frozen, uncomfortable with the misery they insisted on ignoring. That image, the father helping a stranger while his own sons watched from afar, began to corrode something inside them. Not because they felt conscience, but because they realized how that would look if others saw it. For the first time, shame began scratching at the surface of arrogance. When the chaos settled, Mark insisted again on the signature. The father asked with a firm voice why they had forged his name on other documents. His sons froze. Ryan tried to laugh and say he didn't know what the father was talking about, but the father had already seen the papers. This wasn't doubt. It was an accusation. An accusation carrying the weight of decades of unappreciated sacrifice. The conversation soured quickly. Mark whispered, irritated, that it was just bureaucracy, that they had no choice, that everything was to speed things up. The father listened quietly, but something shifted inside him at that moment. Abandonment had been cruel, yes, but forgery, that was a crime. And unlike what his sons believed, he still possessed full clarity to understand the legal weight of that crime. When they left, frustrated for not getting what they wanted, the father remained in the hallway for a few seconds, breathing deeply. His heart raced, but not from fear this time, from decision. He realized he didn't need to chase revenge. The world was already moving on its own, pulling the strings his sons had left loose. And the inspection was coming. And Michael had dangerous information. And the envelope hidden in the suitcase carried a power his sons couldn't imagine. The atmosphere around him grew denser like the air before a storm. At that exact point in the story, he understood that his humiliation was about to become their humiliation, and when the turning point arrived, it would be public, unavoidable, and devastating. On the morning of the inspection, the entire nursing home felt like a stage hastily set up to hide dirt under the rug. Staff who had never smiled were now forcing friendly expressions. Corridors were sprayed with strong disinfectant to mask the smell of neglect, and torn sheets were quickly replaced only in the rooms the inspectors would likely visit. The father, sitting on the edge of the bed, watched the movement with a gaze far too calm for the chaos around him. He knew it was all theater, but for the first time, he didn't feel like part of the cast of silent victims. He knew something no one there could imagine. And that day, it wasn't he who would be exposed. When the inspectors arrived, dressed in sober clothes and holding clipboards, the director greeted them with a smile so fake it seemed poorly glued to her face. She spoke of humanized care, welcoming environment, and social responsibility, while the father and other residents exchanged tired, indignant looks. Michael was there too, sitting on a plastic chair in the hallway, eyes heavy with anger, holding a folder full of reports of wrong medications and photos of bruises on his mother caused by neglected falls. The air was thick with tension, but no one realized that beyond the nursing home, another story on the verge of exploding was walking in through the front door. That was when Mark and Ryan appeared, dressed better than usual, trying to fit into the role of concerned sons. They arrived with serious expressions, but their nervousness leaked through their gestures. The bank had tightened the screws. The risk of losing the new house grew with every ignored call. And now, after abandoning their father, they desperately needed him. The irony of that moment was so brutal that, if the audience were there, they would feel like screaming. They entered the nursing home and immediately ran into the inspectors in the lobby. One of them asked if they were relatives of a resident, and Mark answered yes, trying out an emotional tone, saying they were there to see how their father was being treated. Michael, listening from a distance, almost laughed in disbelief. The inspectors jotted something down on their clipboards, observing the brothers' behavior. It was as if fate had placed all the right characters in the same room, on the same day at the same time. When they reached the hallway where the father was, they found him standing, leaning on the handrail, watching everything without lowering his head. Mark approached first, with that fake smile that no longer fooled anyone, and Ryan right behind him, holding a blue folder. They spoke more quietly this time because they noticed the presence of the inspectors, of Michael, of other eyes and ears. The father felt the weight of that scene and, inside, something aligned. It was no longer just about pain. Now it was about exposure, about truth in broad daylight. Mark began with the predictable, poorly rehearsed speech of regret, saying they had reflected, that maybe they had been too harsh, that they were willing to fix misunderstandings. Nothing in that plea carried real guilt. There was only fear of losing what they believed already belonged to them. Ryan opened the folder and placed some papers on the side table, asking the father to sign them to finally solve the house issues and make sure he'd be fine there. The sentence was so cynical it felt like a slap in the face. But this time the father didn't swallow it in silence. He took a deep breath, looked at both of them and asked in a firm voice if they were talking about the same house that had been financed with a forged signature. The silence that fell over the hallway was thick. Ryan went pale. Mark tried to play it off, but the inspectors already walking around nearby heard the words, "forged signature," like a blaring siren. One of them approached discreetly, pretending to check something in the hallway, but clearly paying attention to the conversation. Michael, seated on a nearby bench, felt the atmosphere shift. The father then delivered the first public blow. He recounted in detail how he had discovered that his name had been used without authorization, how his sons had transferred financial responsibilities for the health plan and the nursing home to avoid any cost, how the abandonment hadn't been an impulse, but a calculated plan. Each word landed with the weight of years of betrayed sacrifice. And now, there were witnesses. Mark lost his composure. He tried to interrupt his father, saying that this wasn't something to be discussed in front of strangers. The father raised his voice for the first time since being left there, and said that strangers were those who abandon their own father on a cold sidewalk and still profit from it. One of the inspectors came fully over, introduced himself, and asked to better understand what was going on. The director, who had been walking toward them with a rehearsed smile, froze at the sight. Inspectors, panicked sons, a lucid resident accusing them of forgery and abandonment. The carefully made-up castle was beginning to crumble, and that was when he decided to reveal part of the secret. In front of everyone, the father revealed that he was not just an elderly man without resources. He calmly said that years before, he had bought a valuable piece of land in Pennsylvania, an area that had recently become the target of developers due to the expansion of a highway. He said his sons had never known about it because he planned to divide everything when the time was right, when he was sure no one saw him as a burden. When the words land and valuable left his mouth, Mark and Ryan's faces changed. The greed that had once been comfortable and hidden now exploded into panic in front of everyone. The inspectors, already noting the problems in the nursing home, perceived another kind of abuse happening there. Familial, financial, moral. Michael crossed his arms, feeling a strange, bitter satisfaction. The director tried to end the conversation, saying that such matters were not the institution's concern. One of the inspectors cut her off firmly, saying that any abandonment and forgery involving a resident was indeed of public and legal interest. The floor seemed to tremble lightly beneath everyone's feet. Desperate, Mark tried to spin things, wrapping his father in a theatrical hug, saying he had no idea the father still had something like that he only wanted to help. Ryan, without a filter, let slip that if they had known about it earlier, they never would have left him there. The sentence came out so spontaneously, so brutally honest, that it felt like the entire hallway held its breath. Two staff members exchanged glances. The inspectors wrote something else down. Michael shook his head in disgust. The father, eyes brimming, not with weakness but with old pain, replied that that was exactly why he had never told them. He said that a family that only sees value when a hidden inheritance is revealed is not a family, it is a parasite. And in that moment, without raising his voice, he humiliated his sons right in front of everyone. They shrank, trying to regain control, but it was too late. They were exposed. It was no longer an intimate matter, it was a public disgrace. And the final blow was still to come. Because in front of the inspectors, the state representative Michael and the staff pretending not to listen, the father explained that days earlier, upon grasping the extent of the cruelty they had inflicted on him, he had sought guidance from a lawyer recommended by Michael, and there in that narrow hallway, he revealed that he had already changed his will. The land, the savings, everything he had saved for decades, was no longer destined for his sons. Mark's face turned red, then gray. Ryan took a step forward, stammering that it was unfair, that their father was being manipulated. The father simply stared at him, with a calm that hurt more than any shout, ready to complete the sentence that would cut the last rope tying them together. And, in front of everyone, with the entire nursing home breathing heavily, he prepared the phrase that would close that scene like a sharp blade, leaving his sons with no ground to stand on, and the audience with their hearts racing, ready for the final twist still to come. The hallway was so silent that even the buzzing of the lights seemed restrained, as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for the final sentence. The sons stood in front of their father, sweating, trembling, on the verge of imploding under the weight of being exposed. The inspectors waited, pens ready, witnessing a scene no one there would ever forget. Michael, steady, watched with the gaze of someone who knew that justice was finally about to reach those who truly deserved it. And the father, leaning on the handrail, was no longer the weakened man who had arrived, abandoned on that cold sidewalk days before. He was someone reclaiming his own voice and his own power. Then he took a deep breath and said, with the calm of someone who had already decided everything, "I removed you from my will. And it wasn't because of what you did to me. It was because of what you became." The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They crossed the hallway like hot iron, striking Mark and Ryan at their most vulnerable point, the place where love had never existed, but self-interest had always lived. Mark was left breathless for a moment as if he had taken an invisible punch. Ryan stepped back, too shocked to hide it. The mask fell off both of them, and it fell hard. The father went on, steady, while the silence became unbearable for his sons. He said that after the abandonment, after the forgery of documents and the calculated contempt, he understood something he might have ignored for years, that it wasn't just about inheritance, it was about character, and that neither of them had the minimum required to carry any legacy of his, neither financial nor moral. He explained that he had spoken with the lawyer, reviewed everything, signed everything, and now everything they thought was guaranteed had been transferred. Mark tried to interrupt, saying it was madness, that he was being manipulated, that the father couldn't make such important decisions in this state. That was when one of the inspectors stepped closer and said that, according to their preliminary assessment, the father showed full lucidity and conscious decision-making. The sentence fell over the sons like a final shovel of dirt. There would be no legal loophole, no chance to contest. They were cornered. Desperate, Ryan tried to appeal emotionally for the first time in his life, something he had never done before. He placed his hand on his father's shoulder, trying to force a hug, saying he was sorry, that he had misunderstood everything, that they just needed to talk. But that hand, as fake as the tears trying to surface, was brushed away with a firm delicacy, almost symbolic, like removing dead weight from on top of oneself. At that moment, the inspectors began questioning the sons about the abandonment, the forgery, the irregular transfer of medical responsibilities. Each question was a blow. Each answer, a stumble. The hallway filled with murmurs from staff who watched the scene without interfering. The director, pale, tried to hide the nervous certainty that all of this would end in a formal complaint, not only against the sons, but against her as well. Meanwhile, Michael slowly approached the father, placing a respectful hand on his shoulder. The inspectors took note. They asked who he was. Michael explained that he was the only person there who had witnessed everything from the very first day, from the brutal arrival, from the cold sidewalk where the father had been discarded like trash, and he confirmed, in front of everyone, that the sons had indeed abandoned him. There was no exaggeration, no distortion. There was abandonment, cruelty, and crime. The humiliation of the sons became more and more public, more inevitable, more relentless. And in that tense, almost suffocating atmosphere, the father revealed the other part of the secret, the one that would seal their fate for good. He announced in a firm voice that the new beneficiary of the inheritance was not an institution, nor a distant relative, nor a community fund. It was Michael. The hallway exploded in shock. Mark stammered something unintelligible, Ryan let out a rough groan, and even the inspectors exchanged stunned looks. The father explained that Michael was the only person, the only one, who had treated him with humanity when he had the least. That he was the only one who saw his worth not by what he owned, but by who he was. While his sons discarded him to save money, a stranger showed compassion. That was what convinced him. That was what sealed the decision. Justice is not only about punishing those who do wrong. It is also about lifting those who do the bare minimum that should always be done, treating another human being with dignity. Desperate, Mark shouted that it was absurd, that a stranger couldn't get everything, that it was unfair, that they had rights. The father, eyes brimming, this time not with pain but with release, replied, "Rights? You lost any right the day you left me on that sidewalk." The silence that followed was deafening. The inspectors officially requested documents from the father, recorded the declaration of abandonment, and requested access to the nursing home's paperwork. Staff ran in a panic. The director tried to justify herself and ended up getting tangled in her own lies. Everything was collapsing at once, the system, the sons, the facade, and at the center of it all, the father stood. For the first time since the beginning of the story, he was above everyone else, morally unshakable, invincible through truth. Mark and Ryan were asked to leave so the inspection could proceed. The image of the two of them walking out under a wave of general disgust was almost cinematic. Defeated, stained, exposed. No excuse worked. No attempt at redemption stuck. They had dug their own grave when they abandoned their own father for convenience. Michael stayed there in disbelief with held-back tears, while the father looked at him with a faint, tired smile. A smile of someone finally free. Of someone who had finally received justice. When everything finally calmed down, when the inspectors finished their notes and the director disappeared into a room to fetch lawyers, the father turned, walked a few steps, felt the pain in his back, but kept going. He stopped in the middle of the hallway, leaned on the handrail, and with everyone still listening, murmured the phrase that would become the final punchline, the phrase that would close that story with the force of a falling hammer. "They called me a burden, but they're the ones who collapsed." And there, in that cold, devastating echo, justice finally found its place. If this story stirred something in you, subscribe now. Here the truth always comes to the surface and justice never fails. And before you go, click on the next video appearing on your screen. It brings another twist just as shocking as this one, and you won't want to miss the moment karma arrives.